Every day the prisoner in solitary confinement is confronted with the same finite set of objects: bed, chair, table, walls, door, bucket. He has seen these so often, has run his hand over them so often, that he knows them by heart. Because he knows that today will be the same as they were yesterday, and that tomorrow they will be the same as they were today, he finds that they have lost the power to look back at him. By contrast, the room in which productive work is being done, the room one enters with anticipation each morning, and which one is free to leave at will, grows sanctified by use. Unnoticed, taken for granted, it is nevertheless felt to be beneficent, almost, for the one at work in it, a blessed space. That's why for the prisoner, a window, however small, is so important. For the sky is never the same from minute to minute or from day to day, and there's always the possibility that a bird will fly across the sky as the prisoner looks out. Moreover, the sense that this is the same sky as stretches over those who are free gives the prisoner daily hope, reminds him every day that he is alive. That is why, too, daily exercise is so important to the prisoner, and, if possible, books to read and pen and paper with which to write. Otherwise, the lack of movement, the lack of conversation with others, the sheer monotony of his existence may gradually lead him to feel that he has lost his own body, and the sense of that loss may make him lose his mind. Of course, when there's nothing to do, there is always the wall to run your finger over. But the prisoner touches the wall of his cell only to remind himself of what keeps him shut in. Or perhaps he is driven by the faint hope that his fingers may tell him what his eyes cannot, that a crack has appeared in the wall, or that the crack which is already there has grown so large that he may just be able to squeeze through it to freedom. He does not merely touch the wall, he examines it, explores its surface, tests its firmness. But it is as he thought, nothing has changed. The following day, however, for want of something to do, he starts to examine it, to test it again. If I touch what I've touched 1,000 times and seen 1,000 times, it's as though I had not touched it. On the other hand, if with my eyes closed, I touch something I cannot recognize, I pull my hand back sharply in fear and revulsion. But what of the familiar feeling of the garden wall under my hand as I leave the house at dawn to walk out into the hills? What of the familiar feel of the tennis racket in my hand as I prepare to serve, of the hockey stick or cricket bat as I take the field? Clearly, it's not just a question of familiarity. It has something to do with trusting things, with taking them for granted as allies and companions rather than as enemies and obstructions. If the garden wall were not there reassuringly under my hand, I would feel that something was wrong. If the racket handle felt unfamiliar, my service would disintegrate. Wall and racket are here like the mother's hand, which the child instinctively takes as he sets out for a walk. He does not take the hand to confirm anything or test anything. He merely takes it because that is what one does at the start of a walk. Yet if the hand is withdrawn, his world collapses. Suddenly that hand, to which he'd never given a thought, becomes the most important thing in the world to him. He realizes he needs it the moment he's lost it. He knows now that he has to have it. He lays siege to his mother till she returns to him. Yet once he's got it back, his attitude to it has changed. He no longer merely holds it. Knowing that it could at any moment be withdrawn, he now clings to it. What had always been there when he wanted it has suddenly been withheld. It's been withheld for reasons the child cannot fathom. And it becomes important, crucial even, that this should not happen again. The owner of that hand, instead of being the unseen, unthought about ground of the child's universe, now becomes an opponent. And calculations have to be made as to the best means of defeating that opponent. Should the owner of the hand be threatened or cajoled or both? It's no longer enough, though, merely to regain the hand a second or third time. What the child needs is for the status quo ante to be regained, for a situation to be put in place whereby the devastating, arbitrary withdrawal of the hand will never again take place. To that end, he bends every thought. To that end, he strains every fibre of his being. Yet the more he clings to the hand he has now got hold of again, the more restless the owner of the hand becomes. The mother had been happy to hold her child's hand, but now that he's started to cling, she becomes less happy. She fears that perhaps this excessive dependence is unhealthy, that it can only lead to sorrow in the future, or she suddenly resents the child's assertion that he has a right to her hand at all times. There's probably a mixture of both, for she is as confused by the emotions she has unwittingly aroused as is the child himself. The fact is that, suddenly, in the place of life being simply lived, there is drama. No one has explored this abrupt and violent transition and its consequences better than Proust. One could almost say that La Recherche, for the whole of its enormous length, explores nothing but that. His life as a unique individual begins for Marcel with an episode very similar to the one I've mentioned. He's gone to bed as usual, and as usual is expecting his mother to come up and kiss him goodnight. But Swann has come to dinner, and his mother's too busy to appear. Marcel grows more and more anxious. Eventually he can stand it no longer and sends a servant with a message to his mother, begging her to come. She doesn't reply. Confusedly, he determines to wait up for his parents and waylay them on their way to bed. He carries out his plan, confronting the surprised and sleepy pair on the stairs with a kind of heroic despair, for while he longs for his mother's presence, he also dreads his father's anger. But there's no other way. He cannot, at this stage, hope to catch his mother alone. To his surprise, it's his father who gives in at once to his entreaty, while his mother, perhaps out of fear of appearing weak and indulgent in front of her husband, tries to refuse. But the father's adamant. Go on, stay with the boy, can't you see he's overwrought? So, Marcel has won. His mother settles down in his bedroom, he climbs back into bed, and she begins to read to him from one of his favourite books, Georges Sand's François de Champy. Her familiar voice soothes him, and his anguish begins to abate. But now he discovers, to his sorrow, that in the new world he's entered, every victory is also a defeat. But how can this be? Marcel has triumphed. He's made his plans and carried them through as boldly as any Caesar or Napoleon. As a result, he's acquired his objective. His mother is there with him in the room. But the fact that he's had to scheme for this has ineradicably affected the situation. He looks at his mother and sees her as if for the first time. She's no longer the ground of his being, but a person in her own right, someone with a will and desires of her own, yet capable of being influenced by external events. And what he sees is a woman no longer young, a woman with a few telltale grey hairs already on her head. In other words, a woman subject to time. A woman being carried inexorably towards the moment when, whatever he may do to try and stop it, she will no longer ever come to him when he calls. His victory over her has made him understand for the first time that the only victor in such conflicts is time, and that once we engage in combat with time, we can only ever lose. Such understanding, however, is worse than useless. This scene is to be repeated with almost monotonous regularity in the course of Marcel's life. What he desires from every woman he falls in love with is that she should come to him of her own accord. But since this doesn't happen, he has to use all his guile and subjective and seductive skill to win her. Having done so, though, he finds, of course, that it's no longer the same woman. His prisoner now, she's no longer the person he so desperately desired. And the more he tries to cling to her, the more he tries to bind her to him, the more anxious, naturally, she becomes to escape. And the more he senses her anxiety, the more he clings to her and tries to hold her. Inevitably, he loses her, as he had that fateful night in Cambrai, in effect, lost his mother. The world for Marcel, before that night, was a world of happy iteration. Days went by, each new and exciting precisely because it didn't threaten to be in any essential way different from the others. Because it was a world grounded in trust. It was a world suffused with aura, a world of reciprocity, in which what you looked at looked back at you. After that night, it's as if Marcel had been projected violently into time and change, desire and frustration. What had simply been life had suddenly become a drama, a story, his story. That's why the details of that fateful night constitute his first clear memory. And that's why this is where the novel proper starts. Not just this novel, of course, but the novel as a form, a way of making sense of experience. The novel, this novel suggests, is always in search of lost paradise, of the paradisal state which existed before it was propelled into existence. And it will not rest till that state is found again. But this novel is a little different. After all, it doesn't start with a withholding of the mother's goodnight kiss, but earlier and elsewhere. And when iteration gives way to linearity, Marcel finds that he's fallen, so to speak, into his life, that unique life which can only be his and no one else's. But also that in a curious secular echo of the myth of the fortunate fool, his sense of loss is precisely what drives him and enables him to write. And writing, he will discover many thousands of pages later, is what will allow him to overcome, at least partially, the trauma of that night, draw the scattered pieces of himself into a whole, even as he recognizes that such wholeness is only a dream of wholeness, something he can reach out for and touch, but never actually grasp. Thank you.